Most of the AI we've been using to date has been processed in the cloud, but this is starting to change. Inferencing work for applications is increasingly being handled on device thanks to advances in processor technology. And the connection from device to cloud is increasingly transparent as Apple and Google and others roll out private cloud compute to seamlessly direct AI tasks to either. Join Olivier Blanchard, Jon Swartz, and me, Stephen Foskett, as we discuss connected AI applications. Welcome to Utilizing AI, the podcast focused on practical applications of artificial intelligence from the Futurum Group. Each episode brings together diverse perspectives to explore news and use cases of the ways in which AI is transforming enterprise IT and the industries it serves. I'm your host, Stephen Foskett, president of the Tech Field Day business unit here at the Futurum Group. Before we dive into today's discussion, let's meet who's on the panel today.
I'm Olivier Blanchard. I'm research director at the Futurum Group, and I focus on AI devices, which is basically everything from the little wearables all the way to vehicles.
Hey, I'm Jon Swartz. I'm senior content writer at TechStrong. I write primarily about AI, although I do dabble into other areas, but primarily I write about AI because everything is AI, it seems, every day.
It sure does seem it like that way. This is, again, I'm Stephen Foskett. I run the AI Field Day event for Futurum, as well as contribute to podcasts like this. And this is one of the areas of focus for me, both here on our Utilizing Tech podcast and as well as the Tech Field Day podcast. This week, we've seen some interesting announcements. We've seen some sort of concerns over AI spending and data center build-outs, but we've also seen some announcements, for example, from Google that they're rolling out their private cloud compute for AI workloads on personal devices and for end users. Of course, Apple has talked about that as well. And this leads me to sort of a core issue when it comes to AI that we've spoken about previously, but I think we should dive in here. And that is this question of sort of the widespread notion that AI is this all-consuming monster that's, consuming, gigawatt data centers and all this. And yet we're all using it every day on devices that are a lot smaller. There's a big difference between training, inference, and just sort of AI as an application component. So Olivier, I want to throw it to you first. Help us understand the ways that AI is used in the real world by real people, and as opposed to what we hear about these big data centers.
Yeah. So there's sort of like you have to imagine that you're on a timeline, which we are. There's what we've been seeing in the last 2 years. There is what we're seeing today, and there is what we'll be seeing in 2 years, and 2 years after that, and 2 years after that. And so the first thing to understand is that initially most of the AI that we've been using has been in the cloud, right? We're accessing it through a browser, through an internet connection. And even though the inputs and the sort of like the touch points are the devices that we use, whether it's a phone or a PC or something else, really most of the work, the training of the AI models and the inference, which is sort of like the processing of your query and then the response, all those things have been happening in the cloud. More and more, though, what we're seeing are two different things. One is we're starting to see a lot more of that inference work moving to devices. So, for instance, instant translation is the type of thing that could happen in the cloud, but works better on device because you don't have as much lag between the input and the output. And we're getting some much better software and much better hardware processors, mainly being sort of like the engines of these new AI capable devices. And so what we're seeing is a lot of the inference work, a lot of that sort of compute heavy work that was a year ago still being done in the cloud can now be moved to devices. So that's the first thing. The other thing is that the hardware, so the processors themselves and the models are becoming more efficient, which means that even in the cloud, even if you're running 100% of your AI workloads in the cloud, which you don't have to anymore, what would still happen is over time, fewer resources would be needed to accomplish the same goals. So you don't need as much processing power, you don't need as much energy The models can be run on much smaller chips, on much better system or smaller systems rather. And what you see is sort of, as AI expands, the needs for the infrastructure around that AI becoming more efficient sort of shrink, which means that you don't necessarily need the type of massive, power hungry data center infrastructure 10 years from now than most of the industry thinks they need to build today, if that makes any sense. So we're moving towards better efficiency, and also a more distributed, sort of federated AI processing ecosystem, where some of it is done in the cloud, some of it is done more locally, sort of like on the edge of a network, and a lot of it moves towards actually being done on the device itself. And so that sort of takes a load away from these big power hungry data centers that we're seeing today.
So, Stephen, can I? So one of the things, Olivier, I totally agree with what Olivier said, but I think what might be happening right now, and I think it's a lot to do with Silicon Valley. I think that Silicon Valley perhaps is inadvertently feeding this narrative of energy and environmental anxiety. And the reason why I say that is that Sundar Pichai, who's the CEO of Google, gave an interview to the BBC, and he basically just warned that not only other tech companies but his own is in danger of this AI investment bubble bursting. And he alludes to spending, but for the most part, he's talking about elements of irrationality in the current market and the buildup to get ahead. And I think this is compounded by the J.P. Morgan Chase study that found that more than $5 trillion, that's trillion with a T, will be invested in data centers and AI infrastructure worldwide over the next 5 years. So, for instance, the figure next year would be about 700 billion. By 2030, it'd be 1.4 trillion. So this, in a sense, it creates a lot of headlines, creates a lot of buzz, creates a lot of talk, which leads to folks like not just Pakai, but Jamie Dimon warning that this AI investment would ultimately pay off, but some of the money being poured into the industry would, quote, probably be lost. That's what Dimon said. So it's this kind of this monster they've created, this Frankenstein monster that Silicon Valley has created in their rush and their exuberance to tell you how much infrastructure they're building out to achieve the training or whatever they want to achieve. So I think they're probably, at part to blame for creating this kind of fear narrative.
But I think it's important to think that at the same time, Google is actively rolling out AI applications to
Yes.
consumers, and consumers are paying for those. So back, that JP Morgan report that you mentioned, they talked about the fact that they're looking for $650 billion of revenue coming from AI
Right.
in order to make this CapEx spend make sense. I think that it's really interesting that JP Morgan was not necessarily negative on AI. They're just basically
No,
stating
they
fact,
weren't.
like, hey, we spent this money. Where's the revenue? And furthermore, they specifically call out that equates to about $35 for every iPhone user or $185 for every Netflix subscriber. So they're trying to give us a sense of the scale that's going to be
Yeah.
required in terms of spending to offset this investment. And when you think about it as $35 per month per iPhone user, you start saying, wait a second, that might actually be achievable if it is end user applications that are kind of bearing the brunt, because of course there are way many Android, Google users, Google ecosystem users. I could see a future in which Google is absolutely making revenue from end users to all offset the incredible hardware costs they're making. I'm not quite so sure about some of the other
Yeah,
companies in the
yeah. I mean,
industry, but I think Google's got a
well,
pretty good
yeah,
plan.
Google's a good example. Google's well positioned. I totally agree on that. I'm also thinking about like an open AI. And they're tied into like more than $1 trillion in these deals around infrastructure. And when you look at their revenue, it's 1/1000th of what they're spending long term. So I think that's kind of I think that kind of gets people's attention, or some folks dwell on it, like our friend Michael Berry, which is another story in and of itself. So our Big Short hedge fund investor who warned about this AI boom and reaching the crater or reaching the edge. He's since kind of disappeared from the scene. But just going back to what you said about J.P. Morgan, I think it was a very cogent, like sober look at what's happening, very reasoned approach, and it is achievable. But I think it's also something that is weighing on people's minds.
Well, and to the point that you just made about, so Barry bet against both OpenAI and NVIDIA, if I recall correctly. We also just got
Yes, you're
news that
correct.
Peter Thiel has liquidated his NVIDIA investments after many years. But I think it's interesting that he reinvested that money in Apple and Microsoft, who are both part of this world. But like we said about Google as well, those are companies that have a plan to make revenue off of this technology. And I think OpenAI does as well. They're building a platform. You look at Apple and Google and their private cloud compute, they're built not on NVIDIA GPUs, but as Olivier was talking about, based on, basically inferencing hardware that is much lower, power consumption, cost, et cetera. And of course, Apple and Google are also deeply interested in, and as is Microsoft, in using mobile devices to do on-device processing. I think this shows us, Olivier, is that the path that you're seeing?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I wrote a piece a few months ago about sort of like the binary model of AI, right? Which was kind of like cloud and device. And actually, I was wrong. I made a mistake. Well, I was right at the time, but it was a failure of imagination on my part because now we're starting to see more of a stack, right? More of a tiered approach to how AI is being sort of ecosystems. Let's
It's a
just verb it,
unified
right?
binary model.
Yeah, well, it's more. So what we're seeing with the Google private AI compute solution or offering that they just announced, and Apple's private cloud compute (PCC), which is very similar, is that you have sort of like a middle layer, right? So you have like the cloud, which is the open cloud, the open web with AI like OpenAI and other solutions like those, Gemini. You have the AI that lives on device that actually works on your PC, in your car, on your phone, in your smart glasses, and then you have this middle layer, which is this private cloud, right? Which in a way sort of bridges the gap between this sort of very distant, laggy, expensive, very high performance, but sort of like low user experience of cloud that's also not particularly secure because you're sending your queries up somewhere. It can be intercepted, it can be captured, it can be sort of mined for information. But then a lot of the processing still can't, that you want from these AI solutions, can't necessarily be handled by most devices. Even if you have the latest device, it might be able to do fairly well compared to devices 2-3 years down the road. And if you have a device that's not really designed for AI, then you're kind of left out in the cold. You have to use cloud. So what this does is it brings a lot of that compute a lot closer and in a much more secure environment, which is, I think, is the most important thing. So the sort of elements of Apple and Google's private AI cloud offerings that really struck me as being important are privacy, right? They're cryptographically secured. It's a hard word to say. A lot of it is post quantum encryption. Apple staff can't access any of your queries, for instance. They can't access any of your history. There's much more security around it because they're running their own. Like Apple is using its own silicon for this, so they have control over the hardware. There's better functionality. I think what we're going to see is this sort of multi-tiered system or ecosystem of AI processing, with some of it going to the cloud, some of it going to sort of private cloud, some of it going to the edge of the network, some of it just staying on device, or even federating between devices. So you have smart glasses and a phone and a ring and a smartwatch. All of these have processing power that can be used together to run workloads locally, right? And they're all constantly pulling data from yourself, from your environments. And so I think that's what we're moving into, this much more organic, sort of ambient type of AI processing that again won't require quite as much input from data centers. And to Peter Thiel's point, and I don't generally agree with Peter Thiel on a lot of things, but what we're seeing, this withdrawal from NVIDIA, to me signals two things. One, what we just talked about, the fact that AI is moving into other areas that don't necessarily require NVIDIA chips and giant Blackwell processors to run training or inference. And the other, that essentially, in because NVIDIA doesn't necessarily, or because we don't need those giant processors, the need for NVIDIA processors moving forward as we shift from training to inference, and inference more and more moving to the edge, NVIDIA sort of loses its momentum. There's not, I don't see a demand for NVIDIA chips. The demand that we've seen for NVIDIA chips, rather, in the last couple of years, really sort of progressing into 2028 or 2029 or 2030. And I think that's a threat for NVIDIA. And I think possibly I'm interpreting these sort of pull aways from the NVIDIA stock as an anticipation of that moment when NVIDIA chips become less of a necessity to run AI.
Forgive me for this. I might be going down a rabbit hole, but what you were just talking about, Olivier, and also Stephen, in terms of Apple, I'm just curious, and this is an open-ended question, and perhaps it's a little bit off track, but in terms of Apple and its AI strategy, or where it's going, and you've laid out where it's going, there's always been a concern out here that Apple is, in a sense, kind of a late player, which is what they do in most markets. But I think in this market, which moves so quickly, there was a definite fear, and that was compounded by folks leaving Apple. There's a rampant rumors that Tim Cook's going to retire in January. I'm just wondering, is that an overblown argument that Apple is not supremely positioned in terms of AI?
It's
I,
no, it.
okay,
Yeah,
I'm sorry, I got to jump in on that one. I feel passionate about this.
Good.
I love Apple's AI strategy, and I know not everybody does. And hopefully, Olivier, maybe you'll disagree with me, and that would be great. I love Apple's AI strategy because Apple so far has not invested big in AI model training, building foundational models. They have not invested big in GPU hardware that we know. They're not listed. None of the publicly available sources suggest. In fact, most of the sources suggest that Apple is leveraging companies like Google and perhaps, I believe, was it Microsoft or I think it was Microsoft. Anyway, that they were leveraging as a service GPUs to do their AI work. They were the first to basically say AI is a feature, not an application. That's kind of their strategy. Apple, what they're calling Apple Intelligence, is basically just a collection of random features all over the place. And some of them are little and some of them are big. And frankly, none of them are all that impressive. But ultimately, what they're focused on is privacy and serving the needs, the sort of daily needs of end users, which to me is just such a supremely practical approach to AI. I love it. And also, as we've said here, one of the things that they announced actually almost 2 years ago now was this private cloud that would basically extend the capabilities of your device. If a query was too big for your device to handle, it would run it in the cloud. And that cloud is literally the same device. In fact, from what I'm hearing, Apple's private cloud so far is just a bunch of Mac Minis. Now they've supposedly just this quarter built their first actual servers with Apple Silicon hardware. At least that's what the reports say. But until now, I guess it's kind of been like Mac Stadium or something up there. You just got a whole bunch of Mac Minis up there that are running stuff. I love this approach because it's not, let's have a chat bot run the world. Let's build an artificial general intelligence. It's let's figure out how we can use this in ways that benefit users. But so far, I don't think anyone has given Apple a dime for any of this stuff, apart from not leaving the ecosystem, which is maybe not the best strategy. Olivier, tell me I'm wrong.
No, you're not wrong.
Oh, come on,
However,
man. I'm relying on
caveat,
you.
caveat.
Okay.
So, and circling back to John's original question, I think it's a mixed bag, right? I think Apple really did miss AI initially. They didn't really see it coming. They weren't prepared. They were focused on other things. And to be fair, I think Apple's missed on a lot of things. They used to be they used to be a very innovative company, right? They were first out of the gate with
Yeah.
features, with form factors, with all sorts of things that were really cool and that made technology be exciting, and everybody was following them. And no dig on Tim Cook. I think he's done wonderful things for the company, and he's an incredible CEO. But I think that there's definitely a Steve Jobs Apple and there's a Tim Cook Apple, and the Tim Cook Apple is much more. He was COO, and you can tell it's very efficient. It's very thoughtful, but it's not necessarily innovation first. And so
It's
what
very
the
supply
joke
chain focused, because that's what Tim Cook was all
and
about.
and
I'm going to
that yeah
make
and
stuff. I'm going to make it at scale. I'm going to have it, quality and yeah, yeah.
Right. And so it's a very efficient machine. It makes a lot of money. It's extremely successful. And really Apple hasn't really paid a price for coming into the market 2-3 years behind Android, for instance, for the phones with features. I thought that it would, but it hasn't caught up yet. And so I don't think that Apple will ever pay the price for this. But there's a joke for us Android users whenever Apple introduces an exciting new feature, which is always my real reaction. I don't know if I'm being punked or if Apple really is excited about releasing a feature that I've had for 3, 4, 5 years on my Android. Right? It's like, you guys didn't have this yet.
That's fun. That's funny
Um,
you say that, Olivier. I was just going to just interject really quickly. So when I used to work at USA Today, so we would all go. They invite like 7 of us to go to these Apple events, and this was the era of a lot of tweeting. So we were part of our job was to tweet as much as write about the event. And almost every response we got from the new feature from Apple was from an Android user saying, "Now you've caught up with us from 3 years ago." So anyway,
yeah.
so
No,
this
that's
was
it.
an
It's true.
ongoing joke.
I would
Yeah,
refute the whole Apple is a leader thing. Apple has never led. I mean, I'm sorry, but
never.
I know at least John is my age. Um, 8-bit hardware era. I remember when the Macintosh was launched saying, "Oh, come on. Like, we've seen graphical environment. I mean, what about GEM, right? What about my Atari ST? I mean, Apple, you know, what Apple does well, and it's the same with smartphones. I mean, honestly, they do deserve credit. Steve Jobs, when he held up that iPhone, it was all screen
Yeah.
except for the buttons. I think that was revolutionary, but for the
Mhm.
most part, like, those of us, I remember I had a creative Nomad MP3 player like 3 years before Apple came out with the iPod, maybe 2 years, but for a long time, I was using MP3s on the go. What Apple does is they integrate these features in a way that's very user friendly.
Yes.
They've never been a leader. They've always been a follower.
Uh,
And
uh,
and I think they remain.
They refine the technology. They make it so easy to use. They understand the customer better than anyone,
shh.
I think.
Yes.
Which of our users thought we would talk about MP3 players and Atari ST
Right.
here on
No, no, no. All,
Get Lucky
all
Hands?
these
Why
things are
not?
true, but the fact is that we would still be using Blackberries were it not for the iPhone.
Hmm?
It's the smartwatch, even just the Apple Watch, is also another example of a revolutionary product. That yes, fine,
Hey,
you know,
There were
the
lots of
smartwatch wasn't
smartwatches
invented,
before. They just sucked.
but they sucked. But Apple does it better, and Apple does lead, right? But in
hey, can
recent
I ask a
years,
quick
I
question
haven't
though?
really
Can I?
seen that from Apple.
Yeah.
Sure.
Getting back to AI
We're getting into
and
it here.
we getting back to AI, with Apple,
Yeah.
is it conceivable? Do you think it's conceivable? I know they don't do big acquisitions; they rarely do them. But Perplexity and Apple and Search, is that something that you could see possibly happening, or am I totally crazy?
Olivier?
No, I mean it's it's possible. But I want to kind of like get back to the thread real quick because the answer might be at the end of it. So you were asking me like did Apple miss? And I think that Apple has had a habit in recent years, in at least the last 2 decades, of coming late to the market, essentially sort of watching what everybody else does, taking the time to figure out what's going to win, what's going to miss, integrating features that have already been in the ecosystem. And so on one hand, it's not great that it takes them that long to do it. On the other hand, it's sort of on par with Apple's strategy. And I think that when it comes to AI, that's sort of where Apple was. They weren't really trying to be on the bleeding edge of what was coming next. They were just sitting and watching and analyzing and figuring out, okay, what do we need to integrate in the next 2-3 years into our ecosystem? And so initially, Apple did miss AI. And I think that it rattled them because usually they don't pay a price. This time they did, and their
Well, so but I
AI
think the
strategy.
difference, I think, but there's a big difference when they waited and then they jump into a market and they were successful. That was under Steve Jobs. So this is under
No,
Cook's
still
watch
with Tim
AI.
Cook. Yeah, no. But I think initially it rattled them because the impact of not being on the forefront of this did hurt them. They realized that they made a mistake. This was different from just features. Um, and so they didn't really have a plan. They didn't have infrastructure ready. They didn't have partnerships ready. They didn't really know what to do with it. And so Apple Intelligence initially felt like something that was cobbled together because Apple needed to have an AI story and have it really quickly. Now what we're seeing is a shift. In the last year, we've seen Apple adapt and figure out sort of what they want to do and where they want to go. And even though they're not pointing the way and saying, okay, we're going to do this, and we're going to create these unique, differentiated Apple only features, what they are doing is testing the waters of what the infrastructure build out needs to be, who the partners need to be. Is it OpenAI? Is it Perplexity? Is it Google? Who are we working with? The flavor of the moment is Gemini. Obviously, they've selected Gemini to be part of that Siri or broader Siri adjacent ecosystem. They're sort of following Google's model as well with private cloud compute and some of the infrastructure and integration into the larger ecosystem play. And I see a lot of parallels between what Google's doing with AI from devices all the way to software and what Apple is doing. The difference is that Apple doesn't have giant data centers everywhere. They're not going to spend tens of billions of dollars building data centers that they know will be obsolete in 10 years. That's not how Apple operates. And so to your point, and to answer your initial question, I think that Apple's AI strategy is a mixed bag of oops, we missed. We need to adapt and adjust and change course and be nimble. But also, it's incredibly smart because they're not following the herd and spending a ton of money on
Yeah.
infrastructure that they might regret having later, right?
So yeah,
They're going to
that's
be more nimble, much more agile, and they're Apple, so their brand can carry whatever mistakes they make because they can just move their business wherever they want.
Yeah.
I always think of their rival or their foil. So it'd be Meta. So Apple always they had this history of comparing themselves to Facebook and Facebook not being a privacy friendly company. And I think about Meta and they've announced this $600 billion investment in U.S. infrastructure and jobs over the next 3 years. So it's the total opposite. It'd be interesting to see that kind of that plays out between the two companies, overspending versus not spending at all.
Well,
Yeah.
I mean, Apple has
What I
announced.
look at,
Yeah.
what I think is interesting is the cloud companies, right? So you have Microsoft, you have Google, and you have AWS, and Amazon is also in the hardware business, right? They have Alexa devices, they have Ring devices, the speakers, the Fire TVs. So they have sort of like this baseline of physical interfaces in the home that I assume will start expanding outside of the home in the next 12 to 24 months, where we start seeing Alexa sort of become more portable. So they have the cloud solution. They can do the private cloud thing, and they have the devices. Google, same thing. They have the cloud, they have the private cloud, they have the devices. Microsoft,
Microsoft.
less
Yeah.
so, but they do have the operating system. They have the PC ecosystem, sort of on not complete lock, but essentially in the enterprise and in education, they're there alongside Google with Chrome and Chromebooks. So what's interesting about these three companies is they really do have all of the elements of the stack, even if they're not completely fleshed out, or you don't really have like full parity between Google and Amazon. My worry about Meta is that Meta's much more of a sort of cobbled together company. They have obviously the Meta XR play, right, with smart glasses all the way to virtual reality, and they do have social and gaming or mobile gaming, and and some retail. But Meta, I think, is much more exposed with its spends than Google, Amazon, and Microsoft. And so I'm a little bit concerned about where Meta's going with this. I'm also concerned that Mark Zuckerberg a few years ago thought that everything was going to be about the metaverse and we were all going to be in
Yep.
virtual
That's why they
reality
changed their
ecosystem or
name. Yeah, among
environments.
other things. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And now he's latched onto this thing, and it feels to me, to come back to our original point, that a lot of the spend that we're seeing, first of all, isn't really spend. They're promises. It's right. It's a pitch. We're going to spend X amount of money
Right.
that has not been spent yet, and that is not being spent yet. But there's this sort of like weird reflex to say, well, we're gonna, if our competitor, someone we perceive as a competitor, is spending $10 billion, we're gonna spend $15 billion, and then it's just kind of like this one upping of everybody else, just to project that their company is going to be the leader in the AI space by virtue of the fact that you're going to outspend everybody else. And I think
And it
that's
goes beyond
partly what's
AI. I mean, I think
fueling this
about
sense that we're
Apple
in a
and
bubble. Yeah.
yeah, but and also, I mean, Apple has made its quote unquote promise, although I don't think they're going to spend like an inordinate amount of money on infrastructure in the U.S. That was more of a political play. But I think you're right. I think these are all promises that we're gonna get like 1/10 of or 1/50th of what they say they're going to spend.
That's
Well,
right. And that is why I think people are getting nervous about NVIDIA, right?
and so
Because
yeah, to kind of bring this all back down. I'm sorry to interrupt, but we're almost at time here to kind of bring this back to the start. You make a very interesting point, Olivier, and I actually amazingly 100% agree with you, even on the Apple part, that Apple kind of missed the boat on AI and was playing catch up and so on. Um, but Apple cogently stated, I think, what the future of AI, at least in personal, is going to look like. This extension from your personal devices up to the cloud, privacy, control of data. Google is absolutely right there. Microsoft is right there. Even Amazon, as you point out, I always forget the fact that their Alexa ecosystem is incredibly powerful. And I also agree that Meta is the one that's really standing on the sidelines here. OpenAI is standing on the sidelines. OpenAI is trying to build an infrastructure, basically the new Windows for AI. But ultimately, if I had to bet which strategy is going to work, I would bet on companies like Apple, Google, Amazon, Microsoft, and not on companies. And it seems like that's where the rest of these are headed, at least from the consumer standpoint. Now, OpenAI may end up being dominating business use of AI or something like that, for all we know. But I think that the companies not named Apple are also going to be fighting for the business market for AI applications as well. But we do have to wrap up. I think that we've got a pretty good stance here. Before we go, one last. You want to make one more point, John or Olivier?
Yeah. No, I
John, go
found
first.
this really fun and interesting. Thanks for
Yeah.
doing this.
Well, I really
Yeah,
appreciate
no,
having
I think I've made all the points I need to make today. But if I'm allowed back, I'm sure there'll be more.
Absolutely. Well, thank you both so much for joining us. And thank you, listeners, for joining us for this episode of Utilizing AI. This is really what we're focused on here. We're trying to figure out where this gets real, where it gets productive, where it gets profitable for enterprise, for the providers of these services, and what doesn't make sense, because we're hearing an awful lot as well about what's going on in the industry. And a lot of us are scratching our heads over this. Before we go, Olivier and John, where can we continue the conversation with you, and where can we find your reporting on AI?
Well, one good place to start is the Future website, where most of my insights are published. Another good place is X, formerly Twitter, OA Blanchard. So I'm pretty easy to find. I'm not the IMF economist. I'm the other Olivier Blanchard. And occasionally, twice a year, maybe I'll be on LinkedIn, but I know that a lot of my content lives there as well, even if I don't. So those are three good places to find me.
Well, I'm just the opposite of you, Olivier. I gave up on X, although I still use it. I don't post on it anymore, but I do use it as a news source. I spend an inordinate amount of time on LinkedIn reaching out to people or interacting with people and posting stories. But for the most part, I'm on TechStrong group, and through Futurum a little bit. But we're gonna get closer and closer and meld both sides together, so you'll see it everywhere.
And as for me, same thing. I'm on LinkedIn a lot. I'm on TechStrong's media sites a lot, including TechStrong Gang, most every Tuesday. I know that Jon, you're there a little bit more often than me.
Just a couple times
And
a day. Yeah,
you'll
a
find
week.
you'll find us as well at techstrong.ai. So thanks for listening to this episode of Utilizing AI. If you enjoyed this discussion, you can subscribe either on YouTube if you like to see what we look like, or in your favorite podcast application if you don't. Please do give us a comment, a rating, a review. That always does help all podcasts. I know everybody says that, but it really does help. This podcast is brought to you by the analysts and experts from the Futurum Group, where insights meet AI. For show notes and more episodes, head over to techstrong.ai, the Utilizing AI YouTube channel, or you can also find us in the TechStrong TV app. Thanks for listening, and we will catch you next Wednesday.